Mr. Chair, ladies and gentlemen, I'm very sorry not to be in person in Boracay Island, but for reasons beyond my control, I couldn't travel to be with you today. In this presentation about fisheries and climate change, I will be talking about the impact of climate change, vulnerabilities, mitigation, and adaptation. But I think we need to be reminded that all our actions with regards to climate change have to be in the context of food security and economic development, as is stipulated in the objective paragraph of the UN Framework on Climate Change. And this is the reason. In spite of advances in recent years, hunger is still at the level of around 800 million people in the world. We have made good advances, both in absolute figures that have gone down and also in relative numbers, but we are still in a position which is unacceptable. And it's not only hunger which is a problem, it is also the number of people that are malnourished and also the growing number of people that are obese. But we see all of this in connection of poverty. The regions where we have abject poverty, we have abject hunger and abject malnutrition. Fisheries play a big role in food and nutrition security. The level of contribution of fish to animal protein consumption is much higher in the least developed countries, particularly the low-income, food deficit countries, than on the average. We can see on the graph that as the absolute intake of animal protein goes down, the proportion of fish of animal protein goes up, which means that these countries are extremely sensitive to changes in the supply of fish. Fish supplies us with a lot of important nutrient elements, not just protein, as is the most commonly named important nutritional element, but also omega-3s, various vitamins and minerals like vitamin A and zinc and vitamin D. And in this small fish on the left, we can see all these nutrients in one perfect package for the daily consumption of these elements. Fisheries also contribute very significantly to the socio-economic development, and the value chains through the production increases step by step. And the ultimate position is that about 12% of the world population is dependent on fisheries for their livelihoods. FAO has as its main overarching goals to eradicate hunger, to eradicate poverty, and to promote sustainable utilization of natural resources. In fisheries, our main initiative is now the Blue Growth Initiative, which has various components developed in various ways that you see on this slide. All the issues that I will be mentioning and discussing later on in this presentation are in one way or another incorporated into our activities based on the Blue Growth Initiative. And we hope that you will be working with us in the realm of the blue growth in the foreseeable future. The pathways of climate impacts in fisheries and aquaculture are quite complex. The biophysical changes from greenhouse gases are through the ocean currents, both sea level rises, rainfall is affected, river flows are affected, lake levels, thermal structures, storm severity, etc. And that affects the various production systems, ecology, fishing and aquaculture, also communities, and the wider society and the economy. The impacts can then be specified on various levels: it's biodiversity and production, distribution, as we'll see later, disease, coral bleaching and calcification. It affects the operations on safety and efficiency, various losses and damages to assets, risks to health and life, displacements, etc. This one shows the major effects, both effects on the corals, the shellfish, biodiversity, and the distribution of the fish stocks around the oceans. We will see on the next slide. This slide shows how stocks are predicted to change the distribution in the future due to climate change. The major effects that stocks are going to be moving from equatorial locations to the poles, more to the north than to the south, and they're going to be moving from coastal areas out to the deeper oceans. This can have major effects, especially on coastal fisheries that are in the equatorial regions. Small-scale fishermen catching their fish from the beach with cast nets will maybe not in the future have the fish within reach of how far they can cast to make a living. So they need to adapt and to develop methods how they can follow the fish further out into the ocean. Opportunities, as I will mention later, will possibly arise at the higher latitudes, where the opening up of the Arctic Ocean will open up space for species that are following the temperature gradient up and down the globe. This slide shows us the impact or vulnerability pathways. The red part of it is developed by IPCC and shows the ecological connectivity of vulnerability, whereas the lower orange and blue part is developed by the sector to show specific impacts on the fisheries and aquaculture sector, on the socio-economic systems, which can be considerable, and if they are not managed properly, can then have a negative feedback on the ecological impacts. This slide shows us a map of the world where the various colors represent the vulnerability estimates for different countries. The dark red ones are the ones that are most vulnerable, and then the lighter colors are less vulnerable. This is a graph from 2009, which is basically based on temperature measurements. So it's not new, but it is, however, still the best one of the kind that we have. Unfortunately, it in many ways mirrors the picture we see when we look at the development status of nations, so that those that are least developed are also the most vulnerable, which makes our attempts to mitigate and adapt even more difficult, but also makes it more necessary. Now let's look at the impacts on various regions. These two pictures on this slide show the predicted effects, or rather the difference between the 2-degree scenario by 2050 and the difference between if the emissions had been at the same level as they were at the year 2000. The upper graph shows the effects of landings of fish in various countries in West Africa. When we look at the lighter bars, which represent the situation in 2000, we see that there are both ups and downs. But when we look at the darker bars for 2050 or the 2-degree scenario, they are all in one direction, to lower landings of fish. The lower graph shows basically the same effect for job opportunities or the loss of jobs because of effects of climate change expected on the fisheries by 2050. We see there that there are ups and downs in 2000, but in the 2-degree scenario, the dark bars are all in one direction. This is quite serious because traditionally fisheries has been a kind of an emergency occupation for many. They have worked on the land, but when disaster has struck, they had moved down to the coast and resorted to fisheries. So this opportunity will not be there in the future. This is a particularly interesting slide which shows change in distribution of tuna in the Pacific with various the stages that the tuna distribution will change by through the years, where due to temperature changes, the distribution of tuna is going to be displaced eastward into the Pacific. The interesting thing, however, is that the communities in the Pacific have reacted to this by setting up management systems which will facilitate the industry and the countries in question to adapt to this by transferring quotas from one company to another or a region to another. But these are the predicted changes, and with regards to the changes, there has to be a reaction. This is a complicated graph which shows both the effects, whether they are positive or negative in the various parts of the Pacific, and also whether the impact is going to be high or low. It varies, and therefore we need to have systems put in place which help us react and adapt to the changing situations. Now let's look at a couple of countries in more detail and how the supply and demand of fish is predicted to change in the face of climate change over the next decades. In China, the population is in fact predicted to fall to slightly below 1.3 billion by 2050. Climate change is expected to decrease marine capture in China by approximately 3%, but fish consumption is still expected to increase, so Chinese aquaculture has to make up the drop and the additional demand. And to do that, using the current available fish meal, the fish in, fish out ratio has to decrease down to about 0.1.5. In the time span that we are talking about until 2050, I would predict that we would be able to respond in this way. Even though the situation with regards to fish meal resources is not a critical one at the moment, but by 2050, if aquaculture is going to grow as it is needed to grow to make up the shortfall in between supply and demand in fish, we will have to find solutions with regards to inclusion of fish meal in the diets. In Bangladesh, the situation is different. There, the population is expected to grow by 2050. However, the reduction in marine capture fisheries and aquaculture is not expected to drop, and therefore very little additional supply is needed to keep up the demand. And we would expect aquaculture in Bangladesh to be able to respond to this challenge relatively easily, but still it would mean that the fish in, fish out ratio has to drop. And now to a different part of the world. The potential impacts of climate change on fisheries in the Arctic are different to what we have been discussing earlier. Basically, the reduction in ice coverage will open up new areas for fishing, and it is likely, and we're already seeing this, the major species in the North Atlantic, for instance, are moving northwards in that direction. Various species, as listed in these slides, will show changes in distribution and possibly in abundance. And possibly some species that are not being utilized today in any major way might be creating opportunities in the future. This we need to see depending on the development and also probably depending on economic factors, market acceptability and prices. However, this calls for some reaction with regards to regional fisheries management. Globally, we have a system of RFMOs which are based on UNCLOS and UN fish stocks agreements and work according to the FAO Code of Conduct of Responsible Fisheries and related instruments. The RMFOs have the prime responsibility for management in the high seas beyond the sovereign EEZs. And the Arctic area is so far only partly covered by RFMOs that have been set up specifically to manage those ocean areas or species in these areas. In this area, we can see the RFMOs that are operational in the Arctic area. The blue area west of Greenland and east of the US is the NAFO area, the North Atlantic Fisheries Organization, which manages that area. And the pink area east of Greenland and west of Scandinavia is the NAFO area. It's the Northeast Atlantic Fisheries Commission area or NEAFC area. This area extends quite far into the Arctic and roughly covers with the smaller NAFO area 1/4 of the area. These two RFMOs, they have a general mandate in their respective areas for the fish stocks, with the exception of tuna, which normally is managed separately in 5 separate tuna RFMOs, one of them being ICAT, which operates in the Atlantic. And the ICAT area actually extends into the Arctic region, as we can see with the yellow overlay. on the slide. So we could say that parts of the Arctic are covered by the present system, but still parts are not, and therefore the international community has to react and set up structures to cover the uncovered part of the Arctic. Now let's turn to mitigation of greenhouse gas emissions. The fishing operations emit considerable amounts of greenhouse gas, but there is quite a substantial possibility to reduce these emissions by both doing changes to the equipment and doing changes to our behavior and management and our maintenance of the equipment that we use. For instance, up to 60% fuel savings could be had by using diesel engines instead of petrol engines. Correct settings of nozzles and propellers could save up to 20% during fishing operations. And we have seen that boats with fouled hulls and propellers often use up to 44% more fuel over an extended period if not cleaned properly. So this is quite positive and shows that we can react and reduce emissions. In general, where and how we produce our food can also have a great impact on emissions. On this slide, you see a comparison between some aquaculture species and the major terrestrial protein-producing species. There, from various ecological perspectives, the aquaculture species are doing much better than the terrestrial animal production systems. I'm not saying that we should stop producing meat and only eat fish, but I'm saying that a shift in emphasis to getting a greater part of our protein from the oceans through aquaculture and possibly still fisheries makes sense from the point of view of mitigating greenhouse gas effects. In general, you can say that the run-of-the-mill aquaculture species does about as well as the best of the terrestrial species, but then the best of the aquaculture species do far better than the best of the terrestrial species. One of these species is salmon, which does particularly well from this point of view. However, we know that we will not feed the world with salmon, and there are limits to how a high-priced, high animal protein utilizing species can be used for that purpose. But however, the salmon industry is an industry which can afford to do research and delve into how to reduce their impact on the environment, and therefore their advances can be lessons learned for other aquatic animals that we could be growing in the future. And we see on this slide how feed conversion rates have improved in salmon production over time, and how greenhouse gas contribution or greenhouse gas release per edible protein unit of salmon, how that has gone down compared to other species, both aquatic species and terrestrial species. So what do we do and how do we do it? Better feeding technologies, better feeds, better management, better genetic improvements, better access to quality feeds, and better management of aquaculture management areas. And how do we do this? Those are the general capacity raising issues through training, both export trainings and bringing people to the areas where the best practices are being practiced, establishing cooperation programs, and sharing technological advances through public and private cooperation. In the field, we are now increasingly faced with adapting to climate change. And there are various projects that are ongoing and have been successful. In Palau, for instance, we are experimenting with new varieties of salt-tolerant taro, and traditional management techniques are being tested and monitoring programs are being introduced to improve both clam and crab farming. In Peru, there are innovative insurance schemes being introduced where index-based instruments are used to predict the occurrence of previously established climate change events using known parameters. In the Seychelles, we are doing ecosystem-based climate change adoption projects. This is done to address flooding from an ecosystem approach. Coastal erosion is being addressed via mangroves, and sand dunes are being rehabilitated. And in this, we are using native species and wetland restoration, and alien species are being removed. and agricultural land reclaimed. In Lake Malawi, we're reducing post-harvest losses. Improved smoking kilns to dry fish have been introduced to address post-harvest losses. As climate change reduces the quantity and quality of fish harvested from the lake, reducing post-harvest loss increases in importance. In addition to reducing these losses, the smoking kilns also reduce deforestation and improve water quality, improving habitat quality for aquatic species and removing an additional stressor for fish. In Bangladesh, very interesting experiments have been done to help in keeping fish in homemade ponds during flooding period. This has both been done to keep fish in the ponds that have been placed there on purpose, but also to keep fish in the ponds that accidentally enter the ponds during flooding. So this is both through stocking and through migration of fish into the ponds by setting up gates, one-way gates, to keep the fish in the ponds, which then later can be harvested. And this has proved to be very effective. In the US Pacific, the acidification of the oceans has affected shellfish hatcheries. And to react to that, monitors have been set up so that in the advance of acidic cold water entering from the Pacific into the hatcheries, the hatchery runners can adjust the acidity and the chemistry of the water in the hatcheries to prevent negative effects from the acidic water on the baby clams. This has proved to be a very successful, even though a very specific attempt or a method to react to climate change in these hatcheries. Okay. In this presentation, I've gone through the various impacts of climate change on fisheries. I've gone through vulnerabilities, both the geographic vulnerabilities and the complex processes, as well as various mitigation possibilities and adoption possibilities. We know that climate change is upon us, and we have to react, we have to do something. We can only do that if we work together and if we show ingenuity in finding new methods. If we do that, then fisheries, and particularly aquaculture, will be able to help us ward off food and nutrition insecurity. And as I mentioned in the beginning, that is a principle or a prerequisite in the objective article of the UNFCCC, the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. Thank you very much.